Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Entry Level Left. If you value the content we create and want access to exclusive bonus episodes, please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/entry-level-left, which is one word. We also post memes, news, and current events on our Facebook page at Entry Level Left. Our link tree in the About section of our Facebook page has links to every platform that you can find us on, and you can also find us on Twitter at Entry Level Left. If you're interested in our shit posting group, we have a Facebook group called Entry Level Left Posting. And if you message us on the Facebook page, we'll gladly send you an invite. So without further ado, my name is Matt.
I'm Jared.
I'm Nathan.
And tonight's episode is about radical academia.
So just to get things started for our listener, the episode being that it's on academic radicalism, what do we mean by that? And how do we view academic radicalism as an extension from liberal academia that we've brought up maybe on some previous episodes?
Yeah, well, I think mainly we're talking specifically sort of about like the we'll call it woke, radical kind of segment of academia that some of us are probably familiar with if we ever had to do research papers in college.
Right.
But I think we're looking at mostly like a level of contradiction that we see in the radical sort of segments of academia. There's those who seek fundamental change and question everything. And then there's those who sort of just adopt that rhetoric and apply it to sort of like mundane, boring daily life shit, or sometimes stuff that is impactful, but maybe not as impactful as it could be, if time was spent elsewhere, like focused on things like, material conditions or something we might talk about on this podcast.
Right.
But I think this is all sort of like best demonstrated by looking at people like Judith Butler or Martha Nussbaum, who are both famous enough feminists, radicals by any standard, to end up on Wikipedia's side panel for feminism. They're like the go-to types of scholars that people might point to. But they're also types of people who literally donate, because it's public record, to the presidential campaigns of people like Kamala Harris or like John Hickenlooper, who I'm 90% sure is actually just like a Republican who checked the wrong box on the voter registration form and just like stuck with it and just never went back. But I think the real question is how people like that can live in a world where their literal job, like they literally get tenure to focus on problems like this. And the best that they can do is come to a conclusion that like student loan forgiveness for Pell Grant recipients who operate a business in disadvantaged communities is like a radical change that we need in the country. Like their rhetoric is somehow extremely political, extremely radical, as we'll say, extremely woke, as we might say, but it's not at all something that really helps the working class.
Right. And so ultimately what you're getting at is that with academic radicalism is that they're radical in what they talk about and they're radical in the things that they theorize. But when it comes down to like the material aspects of it, that radicalism, sort of evaporates.
Right,
yeah.
Right.
Yeah. In practice, they're not radical.
Right.
And it sounds like a really big semantic game that we're playing.
Right.
But there really is a difference between someone who wants to make fundamental changes and someone who just talks like they do.
Right. And I think that highlights that connection between how, while it is considered, academic radicalism, it is an extension of, liberal academia that we've referenced in previous episodes.
Right. So to kind of expound upon that idea, like liberal academia, what we mean by that is it's this performative politic, this politic of aesthetics, appearances over real material change. And often you'll find these figures themselves in their behavior, their actions, their campaign donations. They'll talk the talk, but they won't walk the walk. And so at some point, I assume we'll do an episode on greater detail between the differences of like praxis and theory. Mm-hmm. But really what people need to understand in this particular instance is that you have to walk the walk and talk the talk. And when you don't do both, there's a problem. And it relates to material conditions in the sense that if we take, for example, this Jacobin article, Radical Academics for the Status Quo, which we'll throw in the show notes, talks about Judith Butler and some of her campaign contributions. For example, like Nathan mentioned, the donations to Kamala Harris and John Hickenlooper, these are people that, quite clearly are not radical. There's really nothing radical about Kamala Harris, who has spent her life as a DA prosecuting black and brown people for minor drug offenses and throwing transgender women into male prisons and things like that. Like, there's nothing radical about Kamala Harris. John Hickenlooper is a libertarian, but like you said, he maybe checked the wrong box or he's just confused. But these are people that Judith Butler, a so-called radical feminist, has donated to on public record. So ultimately, the conclusion of the article kind of gets at this point that, it's vulgar to say that these people are not walking the walk and talking the talk in consistency with each other and with their theory and praxis. It's vulgar to say that because they're supposedly academics beyond reproach. But what we're trying to get across here is that this liberal academia is sort of a smoke screen for a greater problem. Because if you look at what these people are doing versus what they're saying, it's not really consistent. So what we mean by radical academia and liberal academia is this this performance, this almost like media cultural product of performance, where you have people saying one thing and then doing a completely other thing, constantly capitulating or giving way to the status quo, and not holding firm in their actual beliefs through their actions.
And so I think all of that kind of highlights, or should highlight for, our listeners, sort of how that radical academic jargon or existence or whatever you want to call it, really fits in there with actual like liberal academia or liberal academics. But to highlight this further, just beyond the explanations that we've been doing, we wanted to actually play a little bit of a game, a two truths and a lie, if you will, but this time related to academic conference papers that we've seen. So the theme here being that we each have found two papers that would fall in the radical academic camp that have been presented at conferences that are real, and we've come up with our own, which is not real, that we have to guess which one is the lie out of all three papers. So Nathan, I don't know if you want to start this or if you found some good ones.
Yeah, I did find a couple. I'm going to throw out three titles here.
Okay.
And you guys let me know which one you think sounds the most bullshit. All right. Rhetorics of fear, deployment of identity, and metal music cultures. Number 2. I'm going to struggle with this one. Polysemy, plurality, paradigms, the quixotic quest for commensability of ethics and professionalism in the practice of yoga.
Oh, okay.
And number 3, looking good and taking care, consumer culture, identity, and poor minority urban tweens.
Oh, God.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Okay.
They all sound very important, in my opinion.
Right.
So good luck, guys.
Okay. Can you read the first one again just for me?
Rhetorics of fear, deployment of identity, and metal music cultures.
Okay. If I had to guess, I'm going to go with the third one as being the lie. What about you, Matt?
Yeah, I think the third one is definitely bullshit.
Can you read it
Actually,
again?
no.
Oh, shit. Okay.
No, you were wrong. So you guys both chose looking good and taking care, consumer culture, identity, and poor minority urban tweens. The real one, the fake one rather, the lie, the one that I made up, and I'll kind of put a note on this one, was polysemy. I don't even know how to say that. Polysemy? I don't know. Polysemy, plurality, and paradigms. The quixotic quest for commensability of ethics and professionalism in the practice of yoga. So that actually is a real paper, but I changed one word, and actually it was the practice of law and not yoga.
Oh, okay.
But I thought, it was just such a beautiful twist of so many words.
Yeah.
And I do want to make a note. That was a real paper, so, I still follow the rules. It's still, changed it. There was definitely a lie in there, but it was just about one word. But one thing I wanted to say is I actually pulled all three of these from somebody I know works in a sort of a social sciences kind of department, and I actually pulled all 3 of these from their PhD dissertations that they had listed on their website.
Oh, damn.
So these are all real. They all come from the same place. So it's always funny to me to think of these giant departments of people who are like studying for years and years.
Right.
And to cap it off, they're writing papers like this.
Right.
You know what I mean? Which are just like completely, in my mind, just completely not useful for most anybody, you
Right.
know? This is restricted to like a very select few of people who this will ever be read by,
Right.
you know, which we'll probably get into a little bit later.
Yeah, of course. But it does still fall within that, like, you know, radical camp. Like, if you were to go to a conference and see any of these papers presented, they would fall under the radical section of the, you know, of the whatever conference that you're at, which I can bring up some experiences with that shortly. All right. So I'll give you my papers that you all can, you know, decipher as you will. So the first one, number 1, is Art as a Tool for Anti-Oppressive Research, the collective creation of performed fiction as an act of resistance. That's number 1.
That sounds cool as fuck, honestly.
Okay, that's number 1. Number 2, hashtag Furs of Color, LGBTQ plus BIPOC inner fandom placemaking and the politics of no politics. Okay, that's number 2.
Oh, God.
It's number
That's
2.
postmodern.
No,
This is tough.
Number 3, territorialized identities, the case for an intersectional approach to assessing the gendered relations between bodies, spaces, and experiences of web-based labor on LinkedIn.
Oh my,
my
God. Oh my God. I feel like that's the red herring though, because I feel like that's every buzzword that we've ever said on this podcast ever to make fun of this type of stuff, all in one fucking title. God, if that's real, I'm gonna hurt myself then.
All right, so what is your guess?
I honestly think the second one's bullshit.
The Furs of Color, LGBTQ plus BIPOC inner fandom
Yeah.
placemaking and the politics of no politics. Okay, so that's
that was my. I agree with you. Like upon hearing it, like I wanted to say that was fake, but I also don't. I don't think Jared could come up with something that fucking like ridiculous. Just like off. I just don't see that. I'm gonna have to go with the third one, just because I feel like if Jared was writing the most satirical thing, that would be it.
okay. So you're going with
3. I'm going with 3.
You're going with number 3, territorialized identities. Okay. So, Nathan, you are correct. That is
Yes!
a lie. That is total bullshit. However, similar to you, Nathan, this was actually a real paper, except for the fact that the only thing that I added, so it goes between body spaces, I added experiences, and it was web-based labor on, I don't know, like computer programming, and I just changed it to LinkedIn. But a good chunk of this was actually a real paper. But
Damn.
all of these, including Furs of Color, which is about furries, all of these were presented at the American Association of Geographers Conference. All of these fell under the radical section of the conference. I know because that's how I found these. And from my own personal experience, I have been to this conference. I have presented at this conference. I have seen presentations at this conference. And it is, there's some good stuff there for sure, but there's definitely some absolute nonsense that, encompasses a lot of the radical #resistance academic crowd. And yeah, I mean, there's just so many different papers and presentations and dissertations like this to go around. These are just some of the most ridiculous. These probably aren't even all of the most ridiculous that I was able to find.
Did you ever have like a facepalm moment when someone was reading something out at a conference that you can remember?
Yeah. So basically, I was sitting in, I think the one for me that, it was at the time, but I think the longer time has gone on, it's gotten progressively even more cringe. I was sitting in a presentation on a paper that fell within like the environmental radicalism sort of category of the AAG conference. And they were talking about how these Canadian foresters were basically modern colonizers because of the practices they were using to harvest their, for the forest, the lumber, was removing a particular, like a rare mushroom species. And they were talking about how the uprooting of this rare mushroom species was a modern colonialism and form of colonialism. And it's like, I can kind of see the argument they were making there, except to kind of highlight the like material relations component is that they were specifically targeting one of the most, well, I should say these lumber workers who are members of one of the most radical Canadian unions in the entire country that typically toes the line for, the NDP isn't like the most radical party by our standards, but the most radical party in Canadian politics, they're typically in support of that political party, which has a far stronger environmental record in environmental politics and indigenous focused politics than any of the other existing parties. And they are certainly one of the most active and radical unions. And it was just like, there was, that sort of thing. What I'm trying to get at is there was such a material disconnect by where the workers were and where this hair splitting paper was trying to find itself within the weeds of some sort of radical conference,
Gotcha.
And so
leave it to the left to eat itself.
Right. Exactly.
So speaking of the left eating itself, let me tell you guys my papers here.
Okay.
All right. Number 1. Can non-full probability internet surveys yield useful data? A comparison with full probability face-to-face surveys in the domain of race and social inequality attitudes. Number 2.
It's like a punchline at the end. It's like, I don't understand what this. At first, I'm like, that sounds kind of normal,
right?
And then somehow race gets tied into it,
right?
Number 2. Moments and butterflies in the geographical political economy of tourism destinations.
Okay.
Number 3. Cultivating fitness and gym culture as toxically masculine ego violence against female body positivity.
Oh
man. My God! All of these.
If I say that third one, am I being toxically masculine?
I don't know, but you're gonna be canceled if you say it.
See, okay, so number two, I feel like as someone with a geography and environmental science background, I definitely could see a paper on that. So I'm gonna rule that one out in my book. I am actually going to go with the first one as being the fake one because I feel like all of it is real except the end part.
Yeah, that I get what you mean because that's how like a lot of the papers are like that.
Right.
Like that one I read about the metal music, it does seem like it's just going to be some like academic nonsense, and then it's just like and metal music.
Right.
It's like what?
It's like
I might have to settle on. I'm gonna go number 3 though, because to me that just sounds hilarious. Honestly.
Okay. So which one is it, Matt?
The first one, can non-full probability, blah blah blah. That's actually from the American Sociological Association, so that's a real paper.
Damn.
Represent.
All right.
Number 2, moments and butterflies in the geographical political economy. That's a real paper too. That's actually from the American Association of Geographers, Jared.
Damn.
That's
okay.
a real one,
man.
Which you were right on. You were right on the nose.
Oh
with
hell
that one.
yeah. I'm 2 for 2.
Yeah,
I'm
Nathan
good
wins.
at something. Finally, I done it.
Yeah, the last one I pulled out of my ass. So
well, that was a good
Nathan
one.
wins.
It was beautiful. It was very like the only reason I could tell is because I could hear your chef's kiss at the end. Like,
But yeah,
Damn.
Nathan wins the game. So I don't know what the reward is, but we can maybe figure that out later.
We'll figure.
I just took a shot, so that's
oh,
my.
well, there you go. So obviously we've just highlighted as examples, kind of how extreme and almost, performative some of these, these papers can sound and kind of can be in the disconnect between the material and all that sort of stuff. But what specifically about the structure of academia leads to this sort of performative wokeness, if you will?
We've got a lot to say on this, and each one of us, can probably go off. But let's kind of zero in on the structure of like how like specifically the Western college system works. Under neoliberalism, and I think anyone that's been to like a major university that's listening to this show can understand what I'm talking about here. People more and more are seeming to be taught what to think, not how to think, and they're being sort of groomed for roles in business. Like you see markets thriving in terms of like computer science, information technology, business, marketing. Those things are always, popping off. Whereas like the humanities, the arts, sciences, like the soft sciences, those things, like if you don't have like a PhD or master's degree, it's pretty hard to find any type of market for those type of skills. I'm sure it's out there, but for the vast majority of people, I can't even tell you how many people that I know who have like bachelors in biology that they work for less money than I do, and I have a 2-year degree, and a bunch of certifications and experience. So like the structure itself of academia leads to this wokeness. It leads to this sense that everyone is their own entrepreneur and everyone is trying to create a product out of themselves almost. And I think this kind of leads to something that you wanted to talk about, Jared, but just this sense of careerism.
Well, yeah, and that's when we talk about the structure of academia and what leads to this sort of performative wokeness or these paper titles and all that stuff, to me, what it boils down to is careerism. And careerism in academia, and how the hair splitting over these cultural issues, this is how these people make a name for themselves. This is how academics, make a name for themselves in order to be able to get a job, because there's more PhDs than there ever has before, and if you're not coming up with the new, latest and greatest snappy terminology, to quote Barack Obama, then you are not going to find yourselves in the halls of the academy, working as a professor or what have you, doing research. I have personal experience with this. Not that I was pursuing academia, but even just seeing how, take publishing in academia, for example. Like, you cannot get published in a serious journal without citing the editors of that journal so that they can get a citation out of your piece. So say you're an academic that falls within the radical academic category, and you want to get published in a major, radical academic paper, let's say like Antipode, if Judith Butler or whoever is sitting on the review committee or as an editor for that journal, you better have her work cited. And in order to get that work in there and cited, you need to be splitting hairs even further than they were, and then citing them as a reference for why you're going sort of down this rabbit hole. And without doing that and checking all these boxes, your work is not going to get published, and therefore you are not going to get grants and research dollars, and therefore a university has no interest in hiring you, because if you're not pulling money in for them, then your value capture is not of interest to them to bring in.
Right.
And I can't, again, this highlights the thing. I can't blame all of these people, right? Because they want to find meaningful employment. They want to be academics. They want to be teachers in a university. They want to do research, and capitalism is partially responsible for this, because the only way for these people to get a job and maintain one is by publishing constantly. And that requires a great deal of hair splitting to stay relevant, especially in the humanities.
Right.
Yeah, that's why we said it's a structural problem. It's not like it's a personal thing that these people are bad. But it's that they're put in these positions because of specific factors in the structure of how things work, and these are the outcomes that it leads to. One part of the sort of echo chamber that I wanted to highlight was also the sort of selection bias on who these people really are. I think one thing to consider first off is that a PhD does take like 8 at minimum years of college to complete.
Right.
4 years of undergrad and 4 years of full-time PhD. Most people are going beyond that. Most are 5 or 6 usually.
Or 10,
undergrad.
because 4-year undergrad, 2-year master's, 4-year PhD.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of time spent in it. And so I think it's important to consider the type of people who actually go and do that type of thing, right? Most people who go to grad school, and this is one of those like sketchy things I'm not sure if I want to say, but here we go. They're privileged,
Yeah.
you know? They had the grades to get noticed. That means that they might have had tutors, they might have had, you know, mommy and daddy know how to fill out job or college applications with them and stuff like that, whatever it might be. You know, they had the ability to get noticed, right, as a high schooler or a undergrad, and then go from there. You know, and the other thing is that they have years of their life to dedicate
Right.
to this pursuit. They have the ability usually to move across country. Most people don't go to grad school in their own area. So anybody who's tied down to their own location, whether it's, you know, kids or sick family members or whatever, you know, they're not an academic. You know,
Right,
they're
right.
staying home and they're not getting their PhD, you know. And you also have to have people who have the economic confidence to take on a career path in something as tough as academia, where there really is no guaranteed jobs, or jobs might be in other cities or other states, or even now you might be an adjunct for years and years before you actually ever become a professor. So you need to be like sort of at a very strong level of privilege to even really become an academic, you know?
Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
A lot of times these people are also coming straight out of undergrad. And one thing I've personally seen is that a lot of them come into the world never actually having held down a real job.
Oh, yeah.
A lot of times they've just been living off of scholarships their whole life.
Yep.
So you really do meet these like 28, 29-year-old people who have literally never worked, right? They've never even stood behind a cash register. They've never had to take a fucking call at a call center. None of that shit that like built who you are as a young worker, none of that is actually built into their psyche at all. You know what I mean? So like, I think it's very important to point out that these people are like a very specific sort of, I don't want to say elite, that sounds kind of like anti-intellectual, but they really are like a really elite part of our society who are all writing these types of papers.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
And it's back to that privilege element. So it's like, you know, and this is sort of a foggy, mystified term really for a lot of people, privilege. But what it
hate it.
amounts to is just like these people straight up had more resources. Like I've been on my own pretty much working since I was 18 years old because I had to. Like I didn't have any other recourse. Like, you know, situation with my family or, you know, circumstances in my life, like, but I was still able to surmount a lot of odds and get, you know, college educated to the point where I can, you know, adapt into the market. So there are outliers, of course. And this is a very specific type of person that we're talking about that doesn't necessarily represent the entire majority of this type of people or this category of people. But for the most part, if you see these type of people who are 28, they've got a PhD, it's like you got to kind of look under the surface and say, where did you get all the time to be able to do this without pulling your hair out and like going into an early grave? B, like you maybe had a great support system or some type of financing. Like it's just in our society, it's not really feasible to get through the type of rigor that it takes to do these things without some type of outside resource or privilege.
Or hold up. And this is why I dislike this privilegedness with all this stuff, because while yes, but also no, there is something else here that can finance a lot of this. It's called a student loan. Okay. Which is why you have people taking out literal student loans to complete their PhDs in whatever it may be. And that student loan includes a loan for housing and all that sort of stuff. So they come out with, yes, their PhD in, you know, whatever fucking field, but they also have 100+ K in debt, right? And so one, I think a lot of the reason why this happens is the fact that some of the people who get involved in this, some of the people like you were talking about, like they're in school and they know that they're good at school, but they don't really know how to do anything else because they haven't worked, or they don't want to because they view it as beneath them. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like I have a greater purpose, and unfortunately, you know, stocking shelves is not what I intend to do with my, you know, historical botany degree. And so there's a whole layer of contradictions here. So I don't want to like, you know, wipe this whole thing over as like it's just a bunch of privileged people, because there's a whole layer to this.
It's like I said, that's one wall of the echo chamber that is academia. You know what I mean? That's just one thing, that there is some sort of selection bias going on. And the thing is too is like there's other forces at work as well. Like I think there's a huge replication problem. You guys have probably heard of like the replication problem in science, right? Before?
I have not. No,
It's just
enlighten me.
it's just that there is a really big problem getting people to just replicate people's studies, right?
Right.
Usually when people talk about this, they're actually talking mostly about science.
Right.
So if someone finds like a really specific, I don't know, chemical reaction or whatever, and they're like, wow, this is possible. Everybody wants to be that guy, the guy who found it. But no one really wants to be the guy who's like, yeah, actually I did that same exact experiment 700 times in a row, and I can confirm what that guy said is true. Like,
Right.
no one wants to be that guy. They want to be the person who's discovering things.
Right.
And I think on the social science side of things, where politics is much more intertwined, we see that same sort of problem. There's really not much incentives to like reinforce old maxims. Like you can't really be a scholar of like Marx or something and just be like, yes, he was right.
Right.
That is my PhD
Yeah.
thesis. There has to be like something built on top of that or reimagined. And in a way, you can imagine that like there's not always going to be a way to do that without really
Reaching.
sort of like reaching. Exactly.
Right.
Yeah, that's
Right.
the word for it. Yeah. And in a way, I hate it because it like kind of ties into the way when you see like Tucker Carlson or whatever, like on Fox News and they're talking about college kids, it really feels like this is the element that they're talking about, is that like there's a certain level of reaching that you see in these academic papers
Right.
that is sort of taken as gospel. And like, I can understand the frustration with them.
Right.
And in reality, a lot of these papers could be correct.
Right.
But I think more what we're pointing out is that why are we spending so much time on really like esoteric subjects
Right.
and not things that could like radically shape the way
Yeah.
we view our lives under capitalism
Exactly.
or just in general,
Well, and that's the thing, because this is where it becomes an issue, because now what you're having happen is you're having a hyper focus on hair splitting cultural issues, and it's obscuring the material issues, at least I feel, that affect everyday working people, similar to like what we were talking about earlier, where, now we're not having discussions about how this or that thing is causing people to be homeless in greater concentration or not have access to healthcare. We're talking about whether or not, twerking as an act of anti-colonial oppression, you know what I mean? Or some just very obscure thing that sounds great in a paper title for an academic conference that can secure you some grant funding, but it is not actually like moving the needle forward on material issues that, again, affect everyday working people. I don't know. What do you guys think about that?
I mean, yeah, and that's the thing. Like we're talking culture now, where it's like the point I wanted to kind of bring it back to for maybe listeners that have been with us from the beginning, and we're talking about the core features of capitalism and how it affects society. Like when we take what we're talking about here with academia and liberal academia, radicalism, all that stuff, and apply it to the very basic principles of what capitalism does on a cultural level, it alienates us from each other, and it also atomizes us to make us think in terms of these, like, what can this do for me? Like, I want, like Nathan said, I want to be the person that makes this study, not the person that has to replicate it 700 times to prove it's true.
Right.
And therein lies the problem. Like we're built on a society that is ideologically geared towards the individual and individualism, and seeing like an individual competing against everyone around them rather than collaborating against or with people around them. And I think that's the core cultural issue that we're trying to highlight here. These things within capitalism are magnified within the processes that underlie them. Like, let's take it back to a fundamental level for a second. The institution, the academy, like ever since it developed in ancient Greece, right? It's been the focus point or the locus of cultivating knowledge, cultivating skills, and adept working, minds and bodies. So it's in the realm of production. It's in the realm of cultural production and knowledge production, things that help humans adapt and evolve in their environments. So this is something that's fundamental to the human animal, the element of being a human. So when we take these things and we atomize them, we get so far away from the point of the academic realm, which is to teach people how to be human beings and teach them how to learn and teach them how to think rather than what to think or what role to fulfill. Like, this is capitalism acting on a cultural element from its pretenses and from its imperatives of alienation and atomization for the sense of, or for the pursuit of profit blindly. And this is what it's ultimately culminating in, is this cultural experience of everyone becoming a cog in a wheel and everyone becoming a competitor for themselves and by themselves rather than a collaborator for the greater good of humankind, for the greater good of science, for the greater good of anything. And that's the problem with capitalism as a structure and the way that it organizes things. And that's why it obscures these material issues for everyday working people. And so we put so much authority onto these institutional figures when realistically, if we look at their behavior versus their words, it doesn't match up. So why do we give them and lend them the credence that they quite clearly don't deserve?
Right, but even taking that and bringing it back though to, the sort of question of, academic radicalism, its shift towards a more cultural focus and obscuring material issues, and by extension of that, capitalism and infecting it. It's, really what I feel all of this coming together is that all the current academic left is doing, and by extension, the contemporary left as well, is really just moralizing the marketplace. And what I mean by that is that I feel that all they're doing with these cultural narratives is writing the narrative for the next, Black Lives Matter themed like Nike advertisement or something. To me, I feel that this has to do a lot with the explosion of college campuses. And as we were talking about earlier, a lot of the careerism that has infested these campuses, where we no longer care about what, when it comes to the left, we, the left, or the academic left, no longer cares about what the left has to offer people, in terms of materially reproducing themselves, their children, etc. And instead, we are splitting hairs over narratives, language, and cultural projects that have very little effect on working people's issues or demands. And that's why, to me, a lot of this cultural pandering, remains an elite project, regardless of the precarity of some of its loudest proponents, like we were talking about earlier, adjuncts, grad students, whatever.
Right. Yeah, I would say, nail right on the head. But then we're going into this topic of neoliberalism and this idea of this academic industrial complex, where neoliberalism and capitalism as structures in the world and society are specifically engineering this type of stuff to produce specific type of people who are products for the marketplace. And that's why these people can only moralize the marketplace, because they themselves have been commodified into products to
Right.
suit the market.
But so what I want to go to then, based on this, is, by obscuring these material issues, how have these cultural narratives in turn alienated the left? Because that's the kind of next point to all of this, right? Is that through all of this sort of culture building around, particular narratives around issues that are not materially based, we now have a left that is virtually unrecognizable by the working class. Do you agree with that? Would you say?
So I think, like, starting off, a lot of leftists were academics,
Right.
like Marx, Luxemburg, Lenin. These are all people who had extreme levels of education. I think between them, there's 2 PhDs and one's a lawyer. So these are all people who really fundamentally shaped leftism, at least the Marxist tradition of it. And yet they were academics. So this wasn't just like an inevitability. You know what I mean?
Right.
There's something specific about our culture that promotes this. Obviously living in sort of like the age of neoliberalism, it's been just exacerbated. In any case, eventually Marxism and socialism, just sort of in general, fell out of favor in intellectual circles. So, of course, we have problems with Stalinism. This becomes sort of really apparent around like the 50s and the 60s. And then, of course, getting towards like the 90s is the collapse of the Soviet Union. So at this point in intellectual circles, it's become insanely difficult to defend these sorts of ideas with that sort of ghost lingering in the background.
Right.
You know? And a lot of these subjects, like postmodernism, anti-colonialism, deconstructionism, feminism, yada, 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 all the different sort of radical academic philosophies that you see today, they weren't actually mutually exclusive to socialism. A lot of these things worked hand in hand with it. A lot of the people who started those traditions were socialists, or at least, you know, radicals or extreme leftists in like the real sense. But as time goes on, we've seen that people are able to remove the socialism element from it, of these areas, and just focus on the parts that can be fully intellectualized, you know, fully removed from the political landscape. And so in that way, once you do that, they become fully compatible with capitalism.
Right.
So now we're thinking of radical capitalism. We're not thinking of like radicalism in general. Now we're now looking at this only from the structure of capitalism, because nobody's talking about the problems of capitalism anymore. They're talking about these problems with racism, these problems with colonialism, these problems with, you know, misogyny and stuff, which again, I want to highlight this a million times. These are real things. These are actually problems, right? But we're trying to tie them back to the larger superstructure, you know, in this case, which is capitalism.
Right.
You know?
And that's such a good point that you made. And, you know, kind of going back to this concept of, you know, the left being alienated because of all this, it's exactly like you were just saying. I mean, even like, you know, a lot of what currently exists is a politics that has been carried over from the 60s and 70s academic left, right? But all of the sort of class radicalism that was a part of those movements has been completely stripped down, and the language and the cultural politics made malleable with the current system. So you have, you know, in this current moment, basically two of the worst possible outcomes, which are the material politics of the neoconservative Reagan era and the materially void politics of a culturally left academic careerist project. And I feel that because of this, you have, you know, workers have begun to associate the economic destruction that has ravaged them since the 80s with the left at large, because they don't associate the left with healthcare and housing and all that sort of stuff. They associate them with their own financial decline and the destruction of more community-based institutions like the family and so on, regardless of what we may think about that and its original conception. But they've only seen these standards and qualities of life go down because of the economic conditions, while culturally those more left, progressive, whatever you want to call it, themes have entered the mainstream. And so by proxy, they're associating the left with that decline and not with the material politics that once dominated the class politics of the left at large.
Yeah, so I just want to highlight there's sort of like an interplay between capitalism acting upon academia and then academia then acting upon capitalism. Like, for example, there's interplay and influence on both sides. Like capitalism, you know, with its imperatives and its alienation and atomization influences the academy and institutions of higher learning in a cultural sense. And then those institutions then, because they are focal points or locuses for cultural and knowledge production in society, then spit out that imperative that they have taken up from capitalism. And that's where you get the moralization of the market. That's where you get people as products, people seeing themselves only as, you know, entrepreneurs that are there existing specifically to create a product or a larger name for themselves. And so ultimately what I think this amounts to is just a giant project for, whether it's conscious, unconscious, it doesn't really matter too much. Like the ruling class is directing these things with some type of intent to take any consciousness away from the material. And to be more clear about that, they're trying to depoliticize everything. And that's why they are taking these things that are inherently left and inherently anti-status quo, economically, politically, you know, in terms of human rights, social justice, economic democracy. All of these things are inherently left-wing ideas. And so they take the radical element of it that appeals to people that are empathetic on a fundamental level in society, and it makes a product or a mockery of these values to sell them culturally to people in academia, in larger society, to take up these ideas and then see them as nothing more than products to emulate or to use as props to gain individual clout or individual success. And so that's the whole web and connection of these things. And that's why, society ends up being the way it is, so alienated, so atomized, so competitive, and so individualistic, especially here in the West.
So with all of that kind of outlined, as you just put it, Matt, how are the cultural politics put forth by the academic left adopted by these larger institutions, namely these, major capitalist entities?
Well, kind of like to your earlier point, like you feel like these college campuses are almost becoming like hotbeds for just market activity, ultimately.
Right.
Everywhere you turn, whether it's like an advertisement for a laundromat or an advertisement for a moving company, advertisement for Microsoft coming in to give you office suite products for your students, like everything on a typical like American college campus is just a hotbed for advertising and market activity. So with that in mind, like it's hard to really not come to the conclusion that, with these cultural products, with the imperatives of capitalism, these things are being influenced on down high. Ultimately, it's a cultural product by the elite to put this into play with neoliberalism. Neoliberalism then affects all aspects of society where, with the academy and the institutions of higher learning in context, these things are, like I have said repeatedly, these are focal points or locuses of knowledge production and cultural production. And then so from their pretenses, like I just said, with capitalism and neoliberalism and all these things in succession, they create a cultural product for society where they're just, again, moralizing the market. These places, these institutions, university campuses are just market hotbeds. They're just places for the next product, the next viral video, the next whatever, the next bullshit script for a Nike ad for Black Lives Matter. It's the total and complete dominance of capital, taking away any type of sanctity that human rights or social justice has and commodifying it completely into a product to be sold to the greater cultural sphere at large.
Well, yeah. And it's like, I even think of like basically it's like over the years, you've seen this greater and greater focus on like, especially in academia, on like Stonewall, right? And like the Stonewall riots. And now it's gotten to a point where it's like anytime on the anniversary of Stonewall, there's like 1 million people sharing memes about like Stonewall was a riot, you know what I mean? But like, there's never any discussion, of course, around that, whether it be in the academy or where else, about like the class politics that made up the Stonewall riots. And so with all of that, you now have like just this, hyper focus on the culture or the event as a cultural phenomenon at the university. It now becomes where, as I think I've said it on the show before, and I've mentioned it all to you a number of times, is when I had to stay at an embassy hotel for work and you go in there and they had a Stonewall selfie station, it's like, it's so easily, and of course there's like all these people and like, like rainbow, like, I forget what those like Hawaiian, the necklaces, the necklaces with the flowers on them, like rainbow lays, like taking pictures at this Stonewall selfie station at an embassy hotel. And it's like, the people involved in that obviously would be horrified by what it's become. But it's like, this is what happens when there is such a disconnect between the class politics that make up these particular movements and when they become separated from or isolated to strictly the cultural phenomenon as a, Stonewall as a cultural phenomenon.
Yeah. And then it just becomes a product. Ultimately.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, you can see that companies will easily adopt some of the more like cultural elements of leftism, but reject the sort of like economic elements, you know? So like, for example, just in recent news, like this week, Twitch actually removed Twitch, who's owned by Amazon, and it's essentially a video game live streaming service where you can watch other people play if you're not familiar. And they removed the tag this week. They no longer support the tag blind playthrough on any of their streams. And they actually removed this out of fear that people would see it as ableist because the word blind is in it, right? Even though this has nothing to do with anyone being blind, and it's sort of a term that's been around for a while, just means playing a video game without any sort of prior knowledge of it,
Right.
just going straight in blind. You know, so it's really just like an idiom of that sort of culture. But in a weird way, you see Twitch trying to sort of change the cultural politics of their platform, and you kind of like have to realize that they're okay doing that. Like, as long as the money is there, as long as this actually is a product for people to consume, that's no problem. They'll adopt those types of things. But how could we ever think of a way where Twitch could make economic changes? You know,
Right.
there's no way they could ever do that type of thing.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Well,
Like, no
Amazon
company
could, but
in the pursuit of, but I mean for the
Right,
worst.
I
You know
know
what I
what you
mean?
mean,
There's
right.
no way that they could do an economically progressive move.
Right.
You know what I mean? These companies are really limited to only doing socially progressive moves. You know,
Right.
another example is Elliot Page
right.
just came out as trans,
right.
right? And with them, they've decided, Netflix that is, since they have a lot of movies that have them in the
The movie.
sort of
yeah.
in the movie itself. So they've actually gone back and changed a lot of the credits with the proper name now,
Mhm.
right? And it's kind of like another one of those situations where it's like they are 100% willing to adopt the culture
Right.
of progressive leftism, but they have really no way of ever doing the same thing economically. You
Right.
know what I mean? We can never rely on these companies to create a culture that is economically left.
Well,
Right.
well, and that's what I'm ultimately the most fearful of is how long until the corporate structures get ahead of the academic structures, right? Because like let's think about this for a second, okay? First of all, most of these companies, and when we talk about like careerism and academia, most of these companies have people who have come from these very like advanced higher learning, places, whether they be academics themselves or they have PhDs, who are the PR people, right? Who write the cultural narratives, who consult as the, cultural consultants, if you will, on how these companies ought to approach all these things and get out looking like the good guy. But what I'm waiting for is when these corporate structures get ahead of academia itself and make it completely irrelevant in their own right, in that they begin the censorship long before it's even being discussed by you and I or, some academic paper or whatever the case may be, where any word that might even remotely, somewhat, in some way in the future be designated as an offensive term or what have you, it immediately gets taken down. It immediately gets censored. It immediately gets, thrown into the recycle bin, what have you, to a point where it's like you have a completely, you're not even, all of culture then henceforth moving forward is being worked on,
Yeah.
manipulated, and driven, again, even more so than it already is, by these large, increasingly consolidated corporate entities.
Right. Well, not to be fatalistic here or anything, but I think it's already happening. Like as of 2008, according to a survey by the Chronicle of Higher Education, presidents from 19 of the top 40 research universities with the largest operating budgets sat on at least one company board. So this is the structure
Right.
of capitalism. This is the society that capitalism produces. Like we can no longer say that it's just individual greed. It's just individuals making poor decisions. This is systemic. And it's not something that can be any longer ignored by people. If you're listening to this, if you're at all aware of left politics, like this is something that you need to do. You need to take control of and make people around you aware of. This is no longer something that is individualized. It's no longer an individual I told you so. It's a systemic structural problem that the government is not doing anything about because the government is the ruling class. It is in cahoots with the private sector under capitalism. So that's what our listeners need to understand about this whole dilemma. It's not the fact that these individuals are just making poor decisions, or these individuals like Judith Butler are donating to Kamala Harris and Hickenlooper, and talking the talk but not walking the walk. These things are structural problems, and it's not any one particular individual's behavior that is the issue. It's the whole system and what it incentivizes that is the problem. And on that point too, I just want to bring up capitalism, makes the accessibility of academic info almost impossible sometimes. Like when we go back to the earlier point that we're making about privilege being so integral to this whole like academic access, it really can't be highlighted any further. It's so clear. Like, for example, we posted a meme on the Facebook page not too long ago, but it was essentially this article or this academic paper that says the increasing inaccessibility of science. And it's like a paywalled article. And it's just like peak capitalist irony that, of course this stuff is inaccessible because it's all based on the profit motive. Like a society built on individualism and the profit motive and individual greed, where there's no incentive for collaboration outside of the profit motive. Of course, you're going to have human beings that don't know how to collaborate, that don't know how to communicate, that don't know how to share with each other, that see greed as the ultimatum in society and see, private enterprise and competition as the end all be all of society, because everything from the accessibility of information is safeguarded by these controls that the elites have put into place culturally and structurally. Like these things all feed into one another. And, we just have to ask ourselves, like, can academic radicalism be redeemed with what we know about how capitalism influences it?
I mean, in my opinion, under capitalism and the role that academia plays now under it, I would say no. I feel like its time has come and gone, because to me, and as I think we've gone over in this episode, and we're really only even scratching the surface, it's academia is firmly embedded in the neoliberal order, despite the language it uses to appear radical and obfuscate reality, as the examples we gave earlier of, Judith Butler and what have you, show. Because to me, what it does now is it's just crafting new complex milieus of jargon that don't go anywhere and are not offering working people a path forward, because it's not based in the material. Because as far as I'm concerned, cultural politics, rigid identity politics can be your only primary concern if material issues are either obscure to you or have no bearing on your class position. To me, it's a careerist enterprise now, and by and for the future PMCs of America, adjuncts or not, and I don't really see much redemption there.
No,
that's just my opinion.
Not to, obviously, I understand where you're coming from. Not to downplay the importance of intersectionality and identity and these things, but ultimately we really have to grasp at the root of the problem. And when we see academics and people that are supposedly radical that we look up to walk the walk when they talk the talk, it's simply not happening because of the incentive structures of capitalism. And that's the primary concern. It's not that class is simply just your relationship to production and that's it, and there's no identity or other characteristics involved in it or categories that are important. But it's the simple fact that society under capitalism incentivizes a very rigid view of identity as a hand-waving tactic to make people forget about the political, forget about the economic. So everything then becomes a cultural product. And that is what people need to understand, because from a propaganda aspect, from a contextual organizing and politicization standpoint, it makes sense how the ruling class would put that into play. They want you thinking about cultural bullshit and identity while they steal all the resources from you and privatize everything. So it has a purpose. And all we're trying to say is you need to understand the purpose as to why these cultural methods of production are in place, why the academy, and why institutions of higher learning exist in this configuration. It's for a purpose.
Yeah, I will caveat that though, and I do enjoy the doomer posting, Jared, 100% always do. But I just have to push back a little bit, and I think it's very important that we at least try.
Yeah.
Right. So if you are
I agree.
an academia person out there, and I just called you privileged like 30 minutes ago because you've never had a job, I still want you as a person to try to fight for material conditions in the academic world because it's very important to us, right? As a society, you might think, well, like, oh, there's only like 40% of people hold even 4-year degrees and much, much less for advanced degrees like graduate degrees like master's degrees and PhDs or any professional things. That's a very select group of people, but at the same time, they set a large precedent for the larger society. I mean, think of your teachers. Think of all the media personalities. How many of those people do you think did not attend college? You know, we're probably talking a very small minority in that sense. And these are really the people who gatekeep all the information in our society. So it's really important that we still have this sort of, I think, small segment of radicalizers in academia, at least doing some sort of work, you know? And I know you guys agree because we all can point to people like David Harvey,
Right.
or, Richard Wolff, people who are like, thoroughbred like academics, they're out there and they are very important. So I think it's, important that we at least have those types of people in the future as well. So yeah, if you're an aspiring Richard Wolff, keep on your pony, boy.
Yeah, just
That's it.
I mean,
end the episode.
Yeah, really
End
just
it.
walk
That's
the
it.
walk, talk the talk.
That's it. We're done.
On ride your pony. We're gonna end it there.
Yes.
Keep
End
on your
it
pony,
on ride
boy.
your pony, boy. That's it.
Yes.
That's the episode.
Stay
That's the
golden.
zinger.
Stay golden, pony boy. All right,
Yeah.
y'all. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Entry Level Left. We hope you enjoyed the episode tonight. Tune in next time for more content. See ya.